Hello, and welcome to Minute Mysteries, where we make and read short crime audiobooks every day. Today, we will be reading The Mirror's Edge. Chapter 1, First Light. Detective Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cold window of her Crown Victoria, watching the steam from her coffee cup fog the glass. The call had come at 5:47 a.m., dragging her from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. Now, as the sun painted the Seattle skyline in shades of amber and rose, she found herself staring at the most peculiar crime scene of her 15-year career. The Meridian Gallery stood like a modernist temple in the heart of the Arts District, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the early morning light in fractured patterns. But it wasn't the building's architecture that had drawn half the police department to this corner of Pine Street. It was what lay inside. "Chen, you need to see this," called Officer Rodriguez from the gallery's entrance, his usually steady voice carrying an edge she'd rarely heard. Sarah crushed her cigarette under her heel, a habit she'd been meaning to quit, and approached the scene. The gallery's front door stood ajar, yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the morning breeze like prayer flags. She flashed her badge to the uniformed officer manning the perimeter and stepped inside. The first thing that struck her was the silence. Not the natural quiet of an empty building, but something deeper, an absence that seemed to press against her eardrums. The second thing was the mirrors. The entire gallery had been transformed overnight. Where yesterday there had been paintings, sculptures, and installations, now stood dozens of mirrors of every shape and size. Antique hand mirrors with ornate silver handles, massive Victorian-looking glasses, modern geometric pieces that fractured reflections into kaleidoscopic patterns. They lined the walls, hung from the ceiling, and stood on pedestals throughout the space, creating an endless maze of reflections. "What the hell happened here?" Sarah muttered, her voice echoing strangely in the mirrored space. "That's what we're trying to figure out," came a voice from her left. She turned to see Detective Marcus Webb, her partner of 3 years, emerging from behind a particularly large mirror that showed her reflection from an impossible angle. The gallery owner, Miranda Glass, yes, that's actually her name, called it in around 5:30. Said she arrived to find the place like this. Sarah pulled out her notepad, though she wasn't sure what to write. Like what, exactly? Someone redecorated with mirrors overnight. "Gets weirder," Webb said, leading her deeper into the gallery. "All the original artwork, every single piece, it's gone. But here's the thing. No signs of forced entry, no damage to the building. And the security system was never triggered." They moved through the mirrored maze, Sarah's unease growing with each step. The reflections seemed to multiply infinitely, creating the illusion that they were walking through an endless corridor of themselves. She caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned, found only more mirrors showing her own confused expression. "Where's the gallery owner now?" she asked. "Back office, giving her statement to Patterson. Well, you'll see." They found Miranda Glass in the small office behind the main gallery space, a striking woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to reflect light like polished stones. She sat rigidly in a chair across from Detective Patterson, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "Ms. Glass?" Sarah showed her badge. "Detective Chen, I understand you discovered the situation this morning?" Miranda's eyes snapped to Sarah's face with an intensity that was almost physical. "You have to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't possible. What's out there? It can't be done. Not overnight. Not without... She trailed off, shaking her head. Not without what? Sarah prompted gently. Magic, Miranda whispered and then laughed, a sound that held no humor at all. But that's crazy, isn't it, detective? Magic isn't real. There has to be an explanation. There has to be. Sarah exchanged a glance with Webb. In her experience, when witnesses started talking about magic, they were usually covering for something much more mundane and often more sinister. Why don't you start from the beginning? Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Miranda. When did you last see the gallery in its normal state? Miranda's fingers worried at the silver pendant around her neck, a small mirror that caught the light as it turned. Yesterday evening, I stayed late to prepare for today's opening. We were premiering a new exhibition, Reflections of the Soul, by local artist David Kemp. 23 pieces, all original works. I locked up at 11:47 p.m. I remember because I was annoyed about missing the late news. And the security system? Armed it myself. The code is changed monthly and only 3 people know it. Myself, my assistant Rebecca, and the cleaning service supervisor. Miranda's voice grew steadier as she focused on concrete details. The system logs show it was armed at 11:48 p.m. and never disarmed until I opened this morning. Webb leaned forward. What about David Kemp? The artist whose work is missing. Something flickered across Miranda's face, too quick to identify, but it made Sarah's detective instincts prick up. David is complicated. He's brilliant but troubled. Has a history of episodes. Episodes? Mental health issues. He's been in and out of treatment for years. Paranoid delusions, mainly. He became convinced that mirrors could show more than just reflections, that they were windows into other realities. Miranda's laugh was bitter. I suppose, in light of this morning's events, perhaps he wasn't as delusional as we all thought. Sarah made a note to look into David Kemp's background. When did you last speak with him? 3 days ago. He seemed agitated, said something about the exhibition being dangerous, that displaying his work would open doors that should stay closed. I assumed it was just pre-show jitters combined with his condition. Do you have contact information for him? Miranda nodded toward a filing cabinet. His file is in there. Though, I should warn you, David doesn't trust authority figures, police especially. He has a theory that law enforcement is part of some conspiracy to suppress knowledge about mirrors and their supposed properties. Another red flag. In Sarah's experience, artists who criticized authority and had mental health issues often became prime suspects when their work went missing. Insurance fraud disguised as mysterious circumstances was more common than people realized. We'll need that file, she said. Also, I'll need to speak with your assistant and anyone else who had access to the gallery. As Miranda retrieved the file, Sarah studied the woman more carefully. Despite her obvious distress, there was something performative about Miranda's behavior, as if she were playing a role rather than genuinely experiencing shock. The silver mirror pendant caught the light again, and Sarah found herself momentarily transfixed by the way it seemed to reflect not just the office's fluorescent lights, but something else entirely. Detective. Webb's voice snapped her attention back to the present. Sorry, just thinking. She took the file from Miranda. One more question. Why mirrors? I mean, if someone wanted to steal artwork, why replace it with mirrors specifically? Miranda's face went pale. I don't know. Maybe because David was obsessed with them? He used to say that mirrors were the most honest art form because they showed truth without interpretation. She paused, her fingers finding the pendant again. Though he also said they were the most dangerous because truth isn't always something people are prepared to see. Chapter 2: Reflections and Revelations. David Kemp lived in a converted warehouse in the Georgetown district, the kind of space that attracted artists who needed room to work and couldn't afford downtown rents. Sarah and Webb found the building easily enough, a hulking brick structure that had once housed a furniture manufacturer and now served as studios and loft apartments for Seattle's creative community. The building's directory listed D. Kemp in Unit 4B, but their knocks went unanswered. Sarah was about to suggest they check with the building manager when a voice called out from behind them. "He's not there." They turned to see a young woman with paint-stained fingers and curious eyes watching them from the doorway of Unit 4A. She looked to be in her 20s, with the kind of carefully cultivated vintage style that suggested art school and trust fund. "I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Webb," Sarah said, showing her badge. "Are you a neighbor of Mr. Kemp's?" "Lily Vasquez," the woman said, not moving from her doorway. "And yeah, David's my neighbor, though I haven't seen him in 3 days. Is he in some kind of trouble?" "We just need to ask him some questions. Do you know where he might be?" Lily's expression grew guarded. "Depends on what kind of questions. David's had some bad experiences with cops before. Sometimes they don't understand that being different isn't the same as being dangerous." Sarah kept her tone neutral. "We're investigating a theft at the Meridian Gallery. Some of his artwork has gone missing." "Missing?" Lily's eyebrows shot up. "But the opening is today. Was supposed to be today. David's been working toward this show for months." She stepped fully into the hallway, closing her door behind her. "What do you mean, missing?" Webb pulled out his phone and showed her one of the crime scene photos. The gallery filled with mirrors where artwork should have been. Lily's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like recognition. "Oh, David," she whispered. "What did you do?" "Ms. Vasquez," Sarah said carefully, "do you know something about what happened at the gallery?" Lily was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph. When she looked up, her expression was troubled. "David's been obsessed with mirrors lately. More than usual, I mean. He's always been interested in reflective surfaces as artistic elements. But in the last few weeks, it became something else entirely." "What kind of something else?" "He started talking about mirrors as portals, said he'd discovered a way to step through them into parallel realities. I thought it was just artistic metaphor at first, the way creative people sometimes talk about their work, but then..." "But then what?" Lily glanced around the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Can we talk in my studio? David's apartment walls are thin, and if he comes back, I don't want him to think I've been talking about him to the police." Her studio was a chaos of canvases, easels, and art supplies, with the large windows typical of converted industrial spaces, flooding everything in natural light. Lily gestured for them to sit on a paint-splattered couch while she perched on a stool near her current work, a portrait that seemed to shift and change as Sarah looked at it. "David's always been eccentric," Lily began, "but brilliant. His work with mirrors and reflective surfaces is unlike anything I've seen. He can create installations that seem to show you things that aren't there, or maybe things that are there but shouldn't be visible." "I'm not sure I follow," Webb said. Lily picked up a hand mirror from her work table, turning it so it caught the light from the windows. Have you ever looked in a mirror and for just a second seen something wrong? A shadow that doesn't match your movement, or a reflection that lingers a moment too long? Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had experienced exactly that phenomenon, though she'd always attributed it to tiredness or trick of lighting. David believed that mirrors don't just show reflections. He thinks they show glimpses of parallel versions of reality, worlds where things happen differently. Most people dismiss these glimpses as imagination or optical illusions, but David was convinced they were real. "And you think this connects to what happened at the gallery, how?" Sarah asked. 3 weeks ago, David showed me something, a mirror he'd been working on, part of the series that was supposed to be displayed at the Meridian. But this one was different from his usual work. When you looked into it, you didn't just see your reflection, you saw... She trailed off, shaking her head. "I know how this sounds." "Tell us anyway," Sarah encouraged. "You saw yourself, but wrong. Like a version of yourself that had made different choices, lived a different life. I looked into it and saw myself as someone harder, colder. I was wearing expensive clothes and jewelry I'd never own, and my eyes..." Lily shuddered. "My eyes looked cruel in a way I hope I never am." Webb leaned forward. Could have been some kind of digital manipulation, screens that look like mirrors, pre-recorded images. "That's what I thought too, but David let me examine the mirror from every angle. It was just glass and silver, completely analog. No electronics, no hidden cameras, and the reflection moved with me perfectly. It wasn't a recording." Sarah made notes, though she wasn't sure what to make of Lily's story. "You said David had been obsessed with mirrors lately. What changed 3 weeks ago?" "That's when he started talking about the crossing. He claimed he'd figured out how to not just see into these parallel realities, but actually step through mirrors into them. He said the exhibition at the Meridian wasn't just an art show. It was going to be a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" "Of crossing over. David believed that if he arranged enough mirrors in the right configuration, he could create a permanent gateway between realities. He said people could walk through and experience different versions of their lives, see what might have been." The pieces were starting to form a picture in Sarah's mind, though not a clear one yet. "Ms. Vasquez, do you think David might have done something to sabotage his own exhibition? Maybe as part of this demonstration?" Lily was quiet for a long time, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the paint-stained surface of her work table. "I don't know, but I can tell you this. 3 days ago, the last time I saw him, David was terrified. He kept talking about them, finding out about his work, about how dangerous it would be if the wrong people gained access to what he'd discovered." "Who are they?" "I never got a clear answer. Sometimes he seemed to mean government agencies. Other times he talked about people from the other side, beings from parallel realities who didn't want the barriers between worlds to come down." Lily laughed nervously. "I know how paranoid that sounds. David's been in treatment for years for exactly this kind of thinking. But what if he wasn't paranoid? What if he was right?" She looked up at them with worried eyes. What if something really is happening with mirrors that we don't understand? Chapter 3. The Assistant's Story. Rebecca Martinez, Miranda Glass's assistant, met them at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the gallery. She was younger than Sarah had expected, mid-20s with an earnest demeanor and the slightly overwhelmed look of someone thrust into circumstances beyond their experience. "I still can't believe what happened," Rebecca said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth despite the mild weather. When Miranda called me this morning, I thought she was having some kind of breakdown. I mean, who steals artwork and replaces it with mirrors? What's the point? Sarah studied the young woman's face for signs of deception, but found only genuine bewilderment. "How long have you worked for Ms. Glass?" 8 months. I started right after graduating from UW with my art history degree. The Meridian Gallery has a great reputation. Miranda's shown some of the most innovative artists in the Pacific Northwest. Rebecca paused, though David Kemp might be the most challenging artist we've worked with. Challenging how? He's incredibly talented, but he has these theories about art and reality that make normal business interactions difficult. Like he insisted that we couldn't photograph any of his mirror pieces for promotional materials because he claimed the cameras would disrupt their resonance frequencies. She made air quotes around the phrase, and he wanted very specific lighting conditions, certain types of bulbs that apparently wouldn't interfere with what he called the mirror's natural properties. Webb leaned forward. "Did you think he was mentally unstable?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I think David sees the world differently than most people, whether that's mental illness or artistic vision, or both. I honestly couldn't say. But I know his work affected people. We had a preview showing 2 weeks ago for potential buyers, and several people had very strong reactions to his mirror installations." "What kind of reactions?" "Emotional ones, mainly. There was this one woman who looked into one of David's mirrors and started crying. Said she saw her daughter who died in a car accident 5 years ago, but grown up, living the life she would have had. Another man claimed he saw himself as a successful businessman instead of the struggling writer he actually was." Sarah felt the familiar tingle that meant a case was about to take an unexpected turn. These people saw things in the mirrors that weren't there? "That's just it. I don't know if they weren't there. I mean, I looked in the same mirrors and just saw normal reflections. But the people who had these experiences seemed genuinely shaken, like they'd witnessed something profound and impossible." Did Ms. Glass witness any of these incidents? She was there for the preview, but she didn't seem as surprised by people's reactions as I was. When I asked her about it afterward, she said that David's work had always been emotionally provocative, and that people sometimes projected their desires and fears onto reflective surfaces. Sarah made a note to ask Miranda about this preview showing. What about David himself? How did he react to these responses? Rebecca's expression darkened. That's where things got weird. David seemed almost disappointed by the reactions, like he was expecting something more dramatic to happen. After the preview, he started making changes to the installations, adjusting angles and adding new elements. He said the mirrors weren't properly aligned yet. Aligned for what? He never said exactly. But he started talking about the exhibition opening being more than just an art show. He called it the breakthrough, and said that after tomorrow, well, today, I guess, everything would be different. Webb exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, do you know where David Kemp might be now? We haven't been able to locate him." Rebecca shook her head. "I haven't seen him since Monday. He came by the gallery to make some final adjustments to his pieces, but he seemed agitated, paranoid even. Kept looking over his shoulder and asking if we'd noticed anyone watching the building." "Anyone specific?" He mentioned seeing the same people repeatedly. A woman in a red coat, a man with a briefcase who always seemed to be checking his phone across the street. David was convinced they were surveillance, though Miranda and I never noticed anything unusual. Sarah thought about this. paranoid delusions were common in certain mental health conditions, but that didn't automatically make them wrong. Did David have access to the gallery security system? No, definitely not. Only Miranda and I have the codes, plus the cleaning service supervisor. David had to be let in whenever he wanted to work on his installations. What about keys to the building? Rebecca frowned. Actually, that's something I've been wondering about. David sometimes seemed to know when the gallery would be empty, showing up at odd hours when neither Miranda nor I were there. I assumed Miranda had given him a key, but when I asked her about it this morning, she said she hadn't. Another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Sarah was beginning to suspect that David Kemp was more resourceful and possibly more involved in the gallery incident than his history of mental health issues might suggest. One more question, she said. In your opinion, would David be capable of orchestrating what happened at the gallery? The removal of all the artwork and installation of the mirrors? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. When she looked up, her expression was troubled. Physically capable? Maybe. David's stronger than he looks, and he has connections in the art world who might help him move pieces quickly. But the why of it... She shook her head. I keep coming back to something he said last week. What was that? He said that sometimes to create a new reality, you first have to destroy the old one. Rebecca's voice dropped to almost a whisper. At the time, I thought he was speaking metaphorically about artistic expression. But now... Now you're not sure? Now I'm wondering if David Kemp might be planning something much more dramatic than any of us realized. Chapter 4. The Other Side of the Glass. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Sarah was reviewing security footage from buildings near the Meridian Gallery when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. If you want to understand what really happened at the gallery, meet me at Cary Park at sunset. Come alone. A friend. Sarah stared at the message, her cop instincts warring with her curiosity. Anonymous meetups were textbook bad ideas, but something about the timing and the fact that someone had managed to get her personal phone number suggested this wasn't a random crank. She was still debating whether to ignore the message when Webb appeared at her desk with a folder of documents. I've been digging into David Kemp's background, he said. Turns out our mysterious artist has some interesting connections. Such as? For starters, he's not just a struggling artist with mental health issues. David Kemp has a PhD in theoretical physics from Caltech, specializing in quantum mechanics and parallel universe theory. He didn't drop out of academia to become an artist. He was forced out. Sarah looked up from her phone. Forced out how? Professional misconduct allegations. Apparently, he was using university resources to conduct unauthorized experiments. The specifics are sealed, but I found references to dangerous research into interdimensional physics and unauthorized human subjects testing. Human subjects testing for what? That's where it gets interesting. I spoke with Dr. Elena Vasquez. Yes, she's related to Lily Vasquez. She's her aunt, who used to work in the same department at Caltech. She was reluctant to talk at first, but when I mentioned the mirrors, she opened up. Webb sat down and opened the folder. According to Dr. Vasquez, David was working on something he called quantum reflection theory. The basic idea was that mirrors don't just reflect light, they reflect quantum possibilities. Every time you look in a mirror, you're supposedly seeing a glimpse of parallel versions of yourself from alternate realities. That sounds like science fiction. Maybe. But Dr. Vasquez said David was brilliant enough to make science fiction sound like legitimate theory. He published several papers on quantum mechanics and parallel universe theory before his research took a turn toward the unconventional. Sarah thought about Lily's description of the mirror that showed wrong reflections. What kind of turn? David became convinced that with the right setup, mirrors could be used as actual doorways between parallel realities. He started experimenting with specific arrangements of reflective surfaces, claiming he could create stable portals that would allow people to cross over into alternate versions of their lives. And the university shut him down? They tried to. But according to Dr. Vasquez, David had become obsessed with proving his theories. He started conducting experiments on himself and volunteer subjects, exposing them to complex mirror arrays while monitoring their brain activity and psychological responses. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. What happened to the volunteers? Webb's expression grew grim. 3 of them had complete psychological breaks. They became convinced they were living in the wrong reality, that they had somehow crossed over from parallel universes where their lives had gone differently. 1 attempted suicide, claiming he wanted to get back to the real world where his family was still alive. The text message on Sarah's phone suddenly felt more urgent. Someone wanted to meet her. Someone who knew about the gallery case and had specifically chosen a location with a commanding view of the city. Someone who might be able to see things from a different perspective. "Webb, I need you to do something for me," she said, making a decision. "Keep digging into David's background, especially his research, and any associates he might still have in the academic world. I'm going to follow up on a lead." "What kind of lead?" Sarah showed him the text message. Webb's cop instincts kicked in immediately. "Absolutely not. Anonymous meetups are—" I know. But someone went to the trouble of getting my personal number and timing this message to arrive just as we're making progress on the case. That suggests inside knowledge. Or it suggests someone's been watching us and wants to lure you into a trap. Sarah considered this, but something about the message felt different from typical criminal contact. "I'll wear a wire and have backup stationed nearby. But Webb, what if this person has answers? What if they know what really happened at the gallery?" Webb studied her face for a moment. "You're thinking this is connected to David's research, aren't you? That maybe his theories about mirrors and parallel realities aren't as crazy as they sound. I'm thinking that we have a case involving impossible circumstances, a missing artist with advanced knowledge of theoretical physics, and now someone who claims they can explain what really happened. At the very least, it's worth hearing what they have to say." Reluctantly, Webb agreed to provide backup, positioning himself and 2 other officers within sight of Carey Park, while Sarah went to meet her mysterious contact. Carey Park at sunset was a tourist's dream, sweeping views of Elliott Bay, the Olympic Mountains, and the Seattle skyline all painted in shades of gold and crimson. But as Sarah walked through the small park, she found it strangely empty except for a single figure standing near the observation area. The woman was tall and elegant, probably in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to reflect the setting sun. She wore a red coat that looked expensive and timeless, and she held herself with the kind of confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being noticed. "Detective Chen," the woman said as Sarah approached. Her voice carried a slight accent that Sarah couldn't identify. "Thank you for coming." "You have me at a disadvantage," Sarah said, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. "You know who I am?" but I don't know who you are." The woman smiled, and something about the expression made Sarah's skin prickle. "My name is Miranda Glass." Sarah stared at her. "That's impossible. I spoke with Miranda Glass this morning. She looks nothing like you." "You spoke with a Miranda Glass this morning," the woman corrected gently, "but not necessarily the same Miranda Glass who sent you that message." "What the hell does that mean?" The woman, Miranda, or whoever she was, gestured toward the view of the city below them. From Cary Park, Seattle spread out like a map, thousands of lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. "Tell me, detective, have you ever considered that there might be multiple versions of every story? Multiple versions of every person?" Sarah's radio crackled softly, Webb's voice checking in. She keyed the mic briefly to let him know she was all right, but kept her attention focused on the woman in red. "Are you going to tell me what happened at the gallery, or are we going to have a philosophical discussion about reality?" "Both, I'm afraid, because what happened at the gallery can't be explained without expanding your understanding of what reality actually is." The woman turned from the view to look directly at Sarah. "David Kemp succeeded, detective. His mirrors work exactly as he claimed they would." "Work how?" "As doorways, portals between parallel realities. The Miranda Glass you spoke with this morning, the one with the silver hair and the nervous manner, she's from this reality. The one where David is a mentally ill artist whose career was destroyed by accusations of professional misconduct." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "And you are?" "I'm from a reality where David's research was taken seriously, where his theories about quantum reflection were validated and funded, where he became one of the most important scientists of the 21st century instead of a dismissed eccentric. This is insane." "Is it?" The woman reached into her coat and pulled out what looked like a compact mirror. She opened it and held it so Sarah could see inside. "Look." Despite every instinct screaming at her not to, Sarah looked into the mirror. At first, she saw only her own reflection, tired, skeptical, wearing the same clothes she'd put on that morning. But as she watched, the reflection began to change. The Sarah in the mirror was wearing a different outfit, an expensive suit instead of her practical detective attire. Her hair was styled differently, and there was something in her expression that was both familiar and foreign. This other Sarah looked confident in a way that the real Sarah had never felt, successful in a way that seemed to come naturally rather than through struggle. "What is this?" Sarah whispered. "It's you," the woman said softly. "A version of you from my reality, where you made different choices, followed different paths." She's a federal agent, by the way. FBI. She specializes in cases involving unusual phenomena and unexplained events. Sarah jerked her gaze away from the mirror, her heart pounding. This is some kind of trick. Digital effects or... "No tricks, detective. Just quantum mechanics applied in ways your reality's scientific community isn't ready to accept." The woman closed the compact with a soft click. "The question now is what you're going to do with this knowledge." "What do you mean?" The gallery incident wasn't a theft or an art installation gone wrong. It was a crossing point being established. David arranged those mirrors in a specific configuration that created a stable portal between our realities. Right now, there are people from my world walking around in yours, and vice versa. Sarah thought about the Miranda Glass she'd met that morning. Nervous, chain-smoking, uncertain. If this woman's story was true, then the Miranda from this reality might not even be aware that she'd been replaced by an alternate version of herself. Why are you telling me this? Because the crossing is unstable. The barriers between realities are breaking down, and if we don't act soon, the consequences will be catastrophic. People will start noticing discrepancies, inconsistencies. Governments will panic. The fabric of both realities could collapse. What do you want me to do about it? The woman handed Sarah a business card. It looked identical to the ones Miranda Glass had given her that morning, except for one detail. The address was different. This is where David is hiding in your reality. He's terrified because he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, and now he doesn't know how to control what he's unleashed. You need to find him before others do. Others? There are people in both realities who would use this technology for their own purposes. Military applications, corporate espionage, personal gain. David is the only one who understands how to safely close the portals. Sarah pocketed the card, her mind reeling. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't an elaborate con game or some kind of psychological manipulation? The woman smiled again, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression. Because, detective, you've already seen the evidence with your own eyes. The gallery filled with mirrors that shouldn't exist. The impossible circumstances that have no logical explanation. The fact that I know details about your case that haven't been released to the public. Such as the fact that David Kemp removed his own artwork from the gallery not to steal it, but to prevent it from being destroyed when the crossing point activated. Such as the fact that the mirrors currently in the gallery aren't just decorative. They're a complex array designed to maintain the portal's stability. And such is the fact that if you don't act within the next 24 hours, the crossing point will become permanent and uncontrollable. Sarah's radio crackled again, Webb's voice more urgent this time. Sarah, we've got movement. Someone's approaching your position from the north. She looked around and saw a figure walking toward them, a man in a dark coat who moved with purpose and authority. Something about his approach made her instincts scream danger. "Who is that?" she asked the woman. "Someone from your reality who has discovered what David accomplished," the woman said, her calm demeanor suddenly shifting to concern. "Someone who wants to acquire his technology for purposes that would be devastating in the wrong hands. Government, worse. Corporate. They see the military and intelligence applications of interdimensional travel, and they want to control it." The woman pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small mirror, similar to the compact, but even smaller. "This will let you contact me if you need help. Just look into it and call my name." The approaching figure was close enough now that Sarah could make out details. Middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit under his coat, moving with the kind of practiced confidence that suggested security or intelligence background. "Detective Chen," the woman said urgently, "you need to decide right now whether you're going to investigate this case using conventional methods or whether you're prepared to accept that reality is far stranger and more malleable than you ever imagined." Sarah looked at the small mirror in her palm, then at the approaching man, then back at the woman in the red coat. Every rational part of her mind insisted this was elaborate fiction, but the evidence of her own senses was becoming impossible to ignore. "Find David," the woman said, "before they do. And remember, not everyone who looks familiar can be trusted. The crossing works both ways." Before Sarah could respond, the woman turned and walked quickly toward the park's exit. Sarah started to follow, but the approaching man called out to her. "Detective Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need to speak with you about the Meridian Gallery case." Sarah turned to face him, her hand closing protectively around the small mirror. When she looked back toward where the woman in red had been walking, she was gone. Chapter 5. Federal Interest. Special Agent Thomas Kane looked exactly like what Sarah imagined when she thought federal agent. Clean-shaven, impeccably dressed, with a kind of neutral expression that revealed nothing while assessing everything. He showed his credentials as he approached, his movements economical and professional. "Detective Chen, I apologize for the dramatic approach, but we need to talk about your current case," he said. "Specifically, we need to talk about David Kemp." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign that he might be another interdimensional traveler or whatever the woman in red had been. But Agent Kane seemed entirely normal, which, given the day's revelations, might itself be suspicious. "What's the FBI's interest in a local art theft?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral while her radio crackled with Webb's voice asking for status. "Art theft?" Kane's eyebrows rose slightly. "Detective, we both know what happened at the Meridian Gallery goes far beyond simple theft. David Kemp has been on our radar for years." "Since his time at Caltech?" "Since before that. Dr. Kemp's research into parallel dimension theory caught our attention when he was still a graduate student. The Defense Department has been quietly monitoring anyone working in areas that could have national security implications." Sarah felt the small mirror warm in her palm. "And you think his art installations qualify?" "I think David Kemp has moved beyond theory into practical application. The gallery incident suggests he's achieved something that our best physicists said was impossible." Kane stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Detective, I'm going to share something with you that's classified, because right now you're the closest we have to finding Kemp before this situation spirals completely out of control." Webb's voice crackled through her radio again. "Sarah, talk to me. What's your status?" She keyed the mic. "I'm fine, stand by." Then to Kane. "I'm listening." 3 months ago, our monitoring stations detected what we initially thought were gravitational anomalies centered around Seattle. Tiny fluctuations in space-time that occurred in regular patterns. When we investigated, we found the epicenter was always wherever David Kemp had been working on his art installations. "You're saying his mirrors actually affect space-time?" "I'm saying David Kemp has somehow learned to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality using arrangements of reflective surfaces. And this morning's events at the gallery suggest he's achieved a breakthrough that could have implications far beyond art." Sarah thought about the woman in red, about the impossible reflections Lily had described, about the gallery transformed overnight. What kind of implications? Kane was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Detective, what would you do if you could step into a mirror and emerge in a world where every mistake you'd ever made had been corrected? Where every opportunity you'd missed had been taken? Where everyone you'd lost was still alive?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah thought about her father who had died in a car accident when she was 16, about the marriage that had ended because she'd been too focused on work, about the daughter she'd never had because timing was never right. "That's what David Kemp is offering," Kane continued, "access to parallel versions of our lives, our world, our reality. Can you imagine the chaos that would result if this technology became public? Can you imagine what hostile nations or terrorist organizations would do with the ability to literally rewrite history by crossing into realities where their enemies never existed. So you want to shut him down. We want to contain the situation before it becomes a threat to global stability. David Kemp needs to be brought in for debriefing, his technology needs to be secured, and any evidence of these parallel dimension crossings needs to be contained or discredited. Sarah felt the weight of decision pressing on her. On one hand, Agent Kane's concerns about the technology's potential misuse seemed legitimate. On the other hand, the woman in red had warned her that there were people who would abuse David's discoveries for their own purposes, and Kane's talk of containing and securing sounded uncomfortably like appropriation. "Do you know where David is now?" she asked. "We have some leads. But detective, you've been investigating this case since the beginning. You know the local players, the artist community, the gallery owner. We need your help to locate him quickly before word of what he's accomplished spreads to the wrong people." Sarah's radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Webb. The voice was unfamiliar, speaking words that made no sense. "Mirror 7 to mirror 1. The reflection is clear. Subject is in play." Both Sarah and Kane froze, staring at her radio. The transmission repeated once more, then went silent. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. Kane's professional composure slipped for the first time since he'd approached her. "That shouldn't be possible. That frequency is encrypted federal—" He stopped himself, but Sarah had already caught the implication. "Federal what? Federal surveillance? Are you monitoring police communications?" "Detective, right now the source of that transmission is less important than its content. Someone else knows about David's work, and they're coordinating some kind of operation." Kane pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "We need to find David Kemp. Now." Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of agreeing to help the federal agent, she stepped back and keyed her radio. "Webb, I need immediate backup at Cary Park, and I need you to run a check on federal agents currently operating in Seattle, specifically anyone named Thomas Kane." Kane's expression hardened. "Detective, you're making a mistake. There are forces at play here that you don't understand." "Maybe, but I've learned a lot today about not trusting people just because they look familiar or claim authority." Sarah kept her hand near her weapon while maintaining distance from Kane. "If you're legitimate federal law enforcement, you won't mind waiting for my backup to verify your credentials." "We don't have time for verification procedures. Every minute we delay gives David more opportunity to—" Kane's words were cut off by a sound that Sarah would later struggle to describe. It was like glass breaking, but deeper, more fundamental, as if reality itself had cracked. The sound came from somewhere behind her, and when she turned toward it, she saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the world. The air above Seattle was shimmering, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But these distortions were vertical, arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to mirror the layout of the city below. And through the shimmering patches, Sarah caught glimpses of a different Seattle, one where the skyline was subtly wrong, where buildings that should have been there were missing, and where the late evening light had a quality that seemed both familiar and alien. "My God," Kane breathed, "it's starting." What's starting? The cascade effect. When barriers between parallel realities begin to break down, it doesn't happen gradually. It happens all at once. Reality bleeding through reality until the distinctions become meaningless. Sarah stared at the impossible vista spread out below them. Through the shimmering distortions, she could see people in the other Seattle going about their evening routines, unaware that their reality was bleeding into another. Cars moved along streets that existed in both worlds and neither, and lights twinkled in buildings that were simultaneously there and not there. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hours, maybe less. Once the cascade reaches critical mass, both realities will collapse into each other permanently. Billions of people will find themselves living in a world that's similar to, but fundamentally different from the one they remember." Sarah pulled out the business card the woman in red had given her, the one with David's supposed location. "Then we better find David Kemp." But when she looked around for Agent Kane, he was gone. In his place stood a different man, older, wearing clothes that seemed slightly wrong for the Seattle she knew, looking at her with eyes full of confusion and fear. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that carried a different accent than Kane's had. "Can you tell me where I am? I was just walking through Pioneer Square and now—" He gestured helplessly at the Cary Park around them. "Now I seem to be somewhere completely different." Sarah realized with a chill that she was looking at someone who had just crossed over from a parallel reality, someone who had been walking through his version of Seattle and had somehow stepped through one of the reality breaks into hers, which meant the cascade effect was accelerating faster than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 6: The Artist's Refuge. The address on the business card led Sarah to a part of Seattle she'd never seen before, despite 15 years of patrolling the city. The neighborhood existed in the gap between Georgetown and SoDo, in a cluster of buildings that seemed to occupy space that should have been empty lots. The streets had names she didn't recognize, and her GPS showed her location as a blank space on the map. Webb had lost radio contact with her 20 minutes ago, somewhere around the time she'd driven past a coffee shop that she was certain hadn't existed that morning. Now, as she parked in front of a narrow building wedged between what looked like a vintage bookstore and a shop selling mirrors of every description, Sarah began to understand that she'd crossed into something more than just an unfamiliar neighborhood. The building matched the address on the card, 847 Reflection Way. The name felt like a joke, but the building itself was real enough. 3 stories of brick and glass with windows that seemed to show different views depending on the angle from which she looked at them. Sarah checked her weapon and the small mirror the woman in red had given her, then approached the front entrance. The door was unlocked, which should have been her first warning. Inside, she found herself in a space that defied architectural logic. The ground floor was larger than the building's exterior suggested possible, filled with mirrors arranged in complex geometric patterns. Some stood upright on easels, others hung from the ceiling at precise angles, and still others were built into the walls themselves. The effect was disorienting. Every step she took created a cascade of reflections that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Detective Chen. She spun toward the voice and found David Kemp standing in the center of the room, though standing might not have been the right word. He appeared to be present in multiple reflections simultaneously, as if the mirrors were showing different versions of him from various angles and distances. "Mr. Kemp, we've been looking for you." "I know. I've been watching." He gestured toward one of the mirrors, which showed a view of Cary Park, where she'd met with Agent Kane and the woman in red. "The mirrors see everything, Detective. They show not just what is, but what was, what could be, and what must not be allowed to happen." Sarah moved carefully through the maze of reflections, trying to keep David in sight while avoiding looking too closely at any individual mirror. She'd learned enough about his work to be wary of what she might see in them. "David, I need you to explain what's happening to the city. People are crossing over between realities. The barriers are breaking down." "Yes." His voice carried a mixture of pride and terror. It worked better than I ever dreamed possible, but also worse than I ever feared. The gallery. You arranged the mirrors there to create a crossing point. I arranged them to create art that would show people truths about themselves and their lives. The crossing effect was unexpected, a byproduct of achieving perfect resonance between parallel quantum states. Sarah found she was beginning to understand the logic of his explanation, which worried her. David, a federal agent, told me the reality breaks are cascading, that both worlds will collapse into each other permanently unless the process is reversed. Agent Kane. David's reflections all smiled simultaneously, and the effect was deeply unsettling. Yes, I've been expecting him, or someone like him. The question is, Detective, which version of Agent Kane did you meet? What do you mean? I mean that the crossing points work both ways. For every person from our reality who steps through into a parallel world, someone from that world steps through into ours. Your Agent Kane might be exactly who he claims to be, or he might be someone from a parallel reality where the federal government developed interdimensional travel decades ago. Sarah felt the foundations of certainty crumbling beneath her feet. How can I tell the difference? You can't. That's the horrible beauty of what I've accomplished, Detective. Once the barriers come down, authenticity becomes meaningless. Every person you meet could be who they appear to be, or they could be an alternate version of themselves with different memories, different loyalties, different goals. Including me? David's reflections studied her for a long moment. Are you the Sarah Chen who grew up in Portland and became a cop to honor her father's memory? Or are you the Sarah Chen who grew up in Vancouver and became a cop to escape a childhood of poverty and abuse? Are you the one who married her college sweetheart, or the one who never trusted anyone enough for marriage? Each possibility he named resonated with something inside her, as if they were all simultaneously true and false. Sarah realized she was no longer certain which version of her own life was the real one. David, can you fix this? Can you close the crossing points and separate the realities again? I can, but Detective, I'm not sure I should. What do you mean? David stepped closer, and Sarah realized he wasn't multiple reflections. He was actually standing in several places at once, as if the mirrors had somehow allowed him to exist in multiple spatial positions simultaneously. Do you know how many people in this world are living with profound regret? He asked. How many go to sleep every night wishing they could undo a single decision that ruined their lives? How many would give anything for the chance to see what their existence would have been like if they'd made different choices? That doesn't give you the right to rewrite reality for everyone, doesn't it? What if reality is already wrong, Detective? What if the world we're living in is the result of countless mistakes, missed opportunities, and tragedies that could have been prevented? What if the parallel worlds I've opened access to are better versions of our existence? Sarah thought about the reflection she'd seen in the woman in red's mirror, the version of herself that looked confident, successful, fulfilled in ways that her real life had never achieved. The temptation to step through and trade places was stronger than she wanted to admit. But what about the people who are happy with their lives? Don't they have a right to the reality they chose? Do they? Or do they just think they're happy because they don't know what they're missing? David's multiple forms gestured toward the mirrors surrounding them. Look around, Detective. Every reflection shows a different possibility, a different path, a different outcome. Which one is more real than the others? Sarah was saved from having to answer by the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the building's upper floors. multiple sets of footsteps moving with military precision. "They've found us," David said, his various reflections showing different emotions: fear, determination, resignation. Who? "The ones who want to control what I've discovered. The ones who see interdimensional access as a weapon rather than a gift." David moved to one of the larger mirrors, placing his hands on its surface. "Detective, you need to choose now. Will you help them capture me and shut down the crossing points, returning everyone to their original realities? Or will you help me complete the process and allow people to choose for themselves which version of their lives they want to live?" The footsteps were getting closer, and Sarah could hear voices, coordinated professionals speaking in the kind of tactical shorthand that suggested military or intelligence operations. Through one of the mirrors, she caught a glimpse of figures in black tactical gear moving through the building's lower level. "David, if I help you, what happens to the people who don't want their reality changed? What happens to the ones who are content with their lives as they are?" "They'll never know the difference," he said simply. "They'll wake up tomorrow in a world that feels exactly right to them, never realizing it's not the same world they went to sleep in." "And if I don't help you?" "Then reality gets locked back into its current configuration, with all its pain and tragedy and missed opportunities preserved exactly as they are. Everyone goes back to living with their regrets, never knowing how much better their lives could have been." Sarah heard radio chatter from the tactical team, voices coordinating entry points and discussing asset containment. These weren't people who had come to negotiate or understand. They were here to take control of David and his technology by force. She made her decision. "David, show me how to help." Chapter 7. Through the Looking Glass. What David showed her was simpler and more complex than anything Sarah had imagined. The mirrors weren't just reflective surfaces. They were windows arranged in precise mathematical relationships that created resonances between parallel quantum states. By adjusting angles and distances, by adding and removing individual mirrors, the configuration could be tuned to open controlled portals between specific alternate realities. "The key is intentionality," David explained as they worked frantically to modify the mirror array while tactical teams searched the building below them. The mirrors respond to conscious will, guided by quantum mechanical principles. You have to know exactly which parallel world you want to access, and you have to want it with absolute certainty. Sarah was beginning to understand the true scope of what David had accomplished. This wasn't random interdimensional chaos. It was controlled access to infinite possibilities. The gallery installation hadn't been art. It had been a machine for rewriting reality on a massive scale. "But how do you know which realities are better?" she asked, while helping him reposition a mirror that seemed to show the room from impossible angles. "I don't. That's the point. Each person has to choose for themselves." David's reflection in the mirror she was holding looked directly at her, while his physical form worked on another part of the array. "Detective, what's the worst decision you've ever made?" Sarah didn't even have to think about it. "I chose work over family. My marriage ended because I was never present, never available. My husband wanted children, and I kept saying, 'someday,' until someday never came." And if you could step through a mirror into a reality where you made different choices, where you prioritized family over career advancement, the possibility was intoxicating. What would happen to the Sarah Chen in that reality, the one who made the choices I wish I'd made? She would step through into this reality. where her career-focused life led to professional success and personal fulfillment through public service. Everyone gets the life they most want to live. It sounded too good to be true, which in Sarah's experience usually meant it was. What's the catch, David? He paused in his work, his multiple reflections all looking at her with the same expression of profound sadness. The catch is that once you start trading lives with alternate versions of yourself, you begin to realize that every choice has consequences. The reality where you chose family over career might also be the reality where your marriage failed for different reasons, or where your children resented your lack of ambition, or where your husband died young because you weren't there to notice the warning signs of his heart condition. So every reality has problems? Every reality has different problems. The question becomes whether you can live with trade-offs you chose consciously instead of trade-offs that were forced on you by circumstances. The sound of footsteps was getting closer now, accompanied by the distinct mechanical noises of tactical equipment. Sarah estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the teams reached their floor. David, if we do this, if we complete your reality choice system, what happens to the people who don't know about the mirrors? What about children, people with mental health issues, people who aren't capable of making informed decisions about alternate versions of their lives? The mirrors only respond to conscious will. People who can't make informed choices won't be able to activate them. They'll continue living in whatever reality they're already in. And the people who would abuse this technology, the ones who would use it for power, wealth, or to harm others? David's expression darkened. That's why we have to get this right the first time. Once the mirror network is fully established and stabilized, it can be programmed with ethical constraints. No one can access realities where their choices cause harm to others. No one can trade places with versions of themselves that involve exploitation or abuse. Sarah heard a radio transmission from somewhere in the building. Asset located. 3rd floor, northeast corner, preparing for acquisition. They found us, she said. David nodded toward the central mirror in the array, a massive antique-looking glass that seemed to show not just reflections, but depths that extended far beyond its physical surface. Detective, it's time. Step through, and you can help me complete this work from a reality where we have more time, more resources, more support, or stay here and help the tactical team shut down something that could fundamentally improve millions of lives. Sarah looked into the mirror and saw herself, but not herself. This other Sarah wore federal agent credentials, moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her career choices, and stood in what looked like a high-tech laboratory surrounded by equipment she didn't recognize. That's the reality where interdimensional research was properly funded and supported, David said, where scientists like me worked with law enforcement like you to develop this technology safely and ethically, where we had years to work out the problems instead of having to improvise under pressure. The alternative reality looked tempting, organized, professional, official, but something about it bothered Sarah. David, in that reality, who controls the technology? Government, military, corporate interests? Well-regulated institutions with proper oversight, and that's not what I asked. Who controls it? David was quiet for a moment. The same people who control every other advanced technology in that reality. The same institutions, the same power structures, the same hierarchies. Sarah realized what had been bothering her about Agent Kane, about the tactical teams, about the whole federal response to David's discovery. It wasn't that they wanted to suppress the technology, it was that they wanted to control it. to determine who had access to better versions of reality and who didn't. "What if there's a third option?" she asked. "What do you mean? What if instead of shutting down the mirror network or putting it under institutional control, we make it freely available? What if anyone who wants to explore alternate versions of their life can do so, with full knowledge of the risks and consequences?" David stared at her. "Detective, that would be chaos. People would be constantly switching between realities, never settling into any life long enough to build relationships or accomplish meaningful goals. Or maybe people would realize that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Maybe having the option to change realities would help people appreciate the lives they already have." The sound of tactical teams had reached their floor. Sarah could hear voices coordinating positions outside the room's entrance. "There's no time to debate philosophy," David said. "Choose. Step through to the organized reality, or stay here and let them shut us down." Sarah looked around the room full of mirrors, each one showing different possibilities, different versions of herself and David and the world they lived in. In some reflections, she saw realities where their conversation continued peacefully, where they had time to work out the ethical implications of interdimensional travel. In others, she saw tactical teams bursting through the door, weapons drawn, demanding surrender. But in one mirror, a small, unassuming piece near the back of the room, she saw something that made her decision for her. She saw Webb. Not her partner as he existed in this reality, but a version of Webb who looked older, sadder, standing at what appeared to be her funeral. The reflection showed him placing a rose on her casket while rain fell from a gray sky. "David," she said quietly, "show me the reality where I don't die today." Chapter 8. The Price of Choice. The reality where Sarah Chen didn't die was subtly but significantly different from the one she'd left behind. She emerged from David's mirror array into what appeared to be the same room, but the tactical teams breaking down the door wore different uniforms. Seattle PD SWAT instead of federal agents. Webb was among them, leading the team with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested he was trying to save her rather than capture her. "Sarah." Webb's voice carried relief and fear in equal measure. "We got your location from the tracker in your radio. Are you all right?" Sarah looked around, disoriented. The mirror array was still there, but David was nowhere to be seen. The building around them looked the same, but felt different. More familiar. More like the Seattle she'd always known. "Webb, how did you find me? My radio's been dead for hours." "Dead?" "Sarah, you've been transmitting your location continuously. We've been tracking you since you left Cary Park." Webb moved closer, studying her face with the kind of attention that suggested he was looking for signs of injury or psychological trauma. "What happened to you? You disappeared for 20 minutes, then your signal reappeared at this address that doesn't exist on any city maps." 20 minutes. Sarah had spent hours with David, learning about parallel realities and mirror arrays and choices between different versions of existence. But in this reality, she'd apparently been missing for less than half an hour. "Where's David Kemp?" she asked. "Who?" Webb looked genuinely confused. "Sarah, there's no one else in this building. We've searched it top to bottom. You were alone in this room with all these mirrors." Sarah stared at the mirror array, trying to understand what had happened. Had David been a hallucination? Had the entire experience of parallel realities been some kind of psychological break brought on by the stress of an impossible case? But the mirrors were real, arranged in the precise geometric patterns David had shown her, and when she looked into them, she still caught glimpses of other realities, including the one she'd just left, where tactical teams in black uniforms were searching an empty room for traces of David Kemp and his interdimensional technology. "Webb, what happened at the Meridian Gallery? Is the case still open?" "What case?" "Sarah, the Meridian Gallery had a normal exhibition opening today. Some local artist named David Kemp showing a series of mirror installations. Nothing unusual, no theft, no missing artwork." Webb's concern was evident in his voice. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? Maybe you should see a doctor." Sarah realized what had happened. She'd crossed over into a reality where David's experiment had never succeeded, where the mirrors were just art instead of interdimensional portals, where the gallery opening had proceeded normally. But the mirrors themselves were still here, still arranged in patterns that could theoretically access other realities, which meant David's technology still existed, even if David himself didn't exist in this reality. "Sarah." Webb's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm going to call an ambulance. You're showing signs of confusion and disorientation, and we need to make sure you haven't suffered some kind of head injury." "No." Sarah backed away from him, her mind racing through possibilities. If this was a reality where David Kemp was just a normal artist, then his interdimensional research had never been discovered by federal agents. The mirror technology was unmonitored, uncontrolled, potentially accessible to anyone who understood how it worked. "Sarah, you're scaring me. Talk to me. What's going on?" She looked at her partner, her friend of 3 years, the person she trusted more than anyone else in her professional life, and realized she had to make another impossible choice. She could tell him the truth about parallel realities and mirror portals, knowing he would think she'd suffered a psychotic break. She could pretend nothing had happened, leaving the mirror technology unguarded and potentially dangerous. Or she could use what David had taught her to access the realities where these problems had already been solved. "Webb, I need you to trust me for about 10 minutes. Can you do that?" "Sarah?" 10 minutes. Just guard the door and don't let anyone else into this room. I need to check something." Webb studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. 10 minutes. But then we're going to have a very serious conversation about what's happening to you." Sarah waited until he had positioned himself by the door, then approached the central mirror in David's array. She placed her hands on its surface the way she'd seen David do, focusing her consciousness on what she wanted to see. A reality where the mirror technology had been discovered and properly regulated, where safeguards had been put in place to prevent abuse. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and she found herself looking into what appeared to be a government research facility. Scientists in white coats worked alongside law enforcement officials, studying mirrors arranged in careful configurations. Charts on the walls showed dimensional mapping theories and ethical guidelines for interdimensional access. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Webb's voice carried a note of alarm. She turned to see him staring at the mirror, which from his perspective probably showed her reflection acting in impossible ways. "I'm solving a problem before it becomes a crisis." "Sarah, step away from the mirror right now." But Sarah had already seen what she needed to see. In the regulated reality, David Kemp worked as a consultant for an interdisciplinary task force that had developed protocols for safe dimensional travel. The technology was available to the public, but with waiting periods, psychological evaluations, and strict limitations on how often individuals could access alternate realities. Most importantly, the mirror networks in that reality were monitored 24/7 to prevent unauthorized access or abuse. "I'm sorry, Webb," she said and stepped through the mirror. The transition was like diving into cold water, a moment of disorientation followed by the shock of finding herself in a completely different environment. She emerged into a sterile laboratory where her arrival triggered immediate alarms. "Unauthorized dimensional crossing," announced a computerized voice. "Security Protocol 7 activated." Within seconds, she was surrounded by people in white coats and security uniforms, all of them looking at her with expressions of professional concern rather than hostility. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen with the Interdimensional Research Division," said a woman who looked exactly like Sarah but wore scientist credentials instead of a detective's badge. "You've just made an unauthorized crossing between parallel realities. I need to ask you to remain calm while we determine which reality you came from and what circumstances led to your crossing." Sarah stared at her alternate self, confident, professionally successful, working in the kind of cutting-edge research facility she'd only dreamed about. "Dr. Chen, there's an unmonitored mirror array in my reality, one that could allow unlimited, unregulated access to parallel dimensions." "That's a Level 1 security concern," Dr. Chen replied immediately. "Agent Martinez, initiate containment protocols. We need a dimensional assessment team prepared for emergency deployment." Sarah found herself in the surreal situation of being debriefed by a parallel version of herself, while technicians prepared to travel to her original reality to secure David's mirror array. The process was efficient, professional, and exactly what she'd hoped to find: an organization that took interdimensional security seriously while still allowing people access to the technology. "The question now," Dr. Chen said as they watched technicians stepping through a mirror portal into Sarah's original reality, "is which version of your life you want to return to. You can go back to your reality as a detective, investigating an impossible case. You can stay here and work with our research division, or we can facilitate your access to any other parallel version of your existence." Sarah thought about the choice David had offered her, the reality where she'd chosen family over career, where her personal life had been happier, but her professional contributions had been different. She thought about the Webb she'd left behind, worried and confused, guarding a door while not understanding the crisis she was trying to prevent. "I want to go back," she said, "to my reality, my life, my partner. But I want to go back knowing that the mirror technology is going to be properly handled." Dr. Chen smiled, an expression that looked strange on what was essentially Sarah's own face. That's the most common choice people make when they're offered alternatives to their existing lives. Most of us, when it comes down to it, prefer the lives we've already built, even with their problems and limitations. And the people who don't, the ones who choose to trade realities, they usually find that their problems follow them between dimensions because the problems were internal rather than circumstantial. But sometimes, rarely, they find exactly what they were looking for. Dr. Chen gestured toward the mirror portal. "Your reality will be designated as a Level 7 interdimensional access point. We'll establish monitoring stations and provide public access to dimensional crossing technology, along with appropriate counseling and safety protocols." What happens to the version of me in this reality? The Dr. Chen, who should be here, she'll step through into your reality and become the lead scientist for establishing dimensional research protocols there. Everyone gets the life they're most suited for. Sarah looked into the mirror portal one more time before stepping through. In its surface, she could see Webb still standing guard, checking his watch and looking increasingly concerned. She could see the mirror array that David had built, waiting to be secured and regulated and made available to people who might benefit from seeing alternate versions of their lives. But mostly, she could see herself as she really was, not the confident federal agent or the successful scientist or the happily married mother she might have been in other realities. She was Detective Sarah Chen, a woman who had made choices both good and bad, who lived with regrets and achievements in equal measure, and who had just prevented a potentially dangerous technology from falling into the wrong hands. It was a life worth living. She stepped through the mirror and back into her own reality. Chapter 9. Reflections. Sarah! Webb's relief was immediate and obvious as she emerged from the mirror. What just happened? 1 second you were touching the mirror, the next you were gone. The reflection was empty. Sarah looked around the room and saw that it had changed subtly. The mirror array was still there, but now it was surrounded by monitoring equipment that hadn't existed before. Men and women in white coats were documenting the positions and angles of each mirror, while technicians installed what looked like security cameras and motion sensors. "The Interdimensional Research Team," she said, more to herself than to Webb. "The what now?" Webb stared at her, then at the scientists working around them. "Sarah, these people showed up about 30 seconds after you disappeared. They said they were responding to an unauthorized dimensional event. They have federal credentials and equipment I've never seen before." One of the scientists, a woman who looked familiar but wasn't quite Dr. Chen from the parallel reality, approached them with a clipboard and a reassuring smile. "Detective Chen?" "I'm Dr. Rebecca Martinez with the Department of Interdimensional Affairs. We understand you've had quite an experience today, and we'd like to debrief you about what you observed during your crossing." Department of Interdimensional Affairs? Webb looked back and forth between Sarah and Dr. Martinez. Since when does that exist? "Since about an hour ago," Dr. Martinez said calmly. "The discovery of stable dimensional crossing technology required immediate federal response and regulation. Detective Chen's actions in containing the situation and reporting through proper channels helped us establish protocols much faster than would normally be possible." Sarah realized that her crossing into the regulated reality had somehow caused that reality's governmental structure to bleed back into her own. The monitoring systems, the research teams, the official protocols, they now existed in her reality because she had demonstrated that they were necessary. "What about David Kemp?" she asked. "Dr. Kemp is currently working with our research division to ensure that dimensional crossing technology is implemented safely and ethically. He'll be receiving recognition for his breakthrough discoveries as well as counseling to help him process the psychological impact of interdimensional access." "And the people who crossed over during the initial event?" Dr. Martinez consulted her clipboard. "We've identified 17 individuals who inadvertently crossed between realities during the Cascade event. All have been located and offered the choice to return to their original realities or remain where they are, provided they undergo psychological evaluation and integration counseling." Webb raised his hand like a confused student. "Can someone please explain to me what's happening here? This morning I was investigating an art theft, and now apparently we're dealing with parallel universes." Sarah put a hand on her partner's shoulder. "Webb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you remember anything unusual about today's investigation? Anything that seemed impossible or didn't make sense?" Webb considered the question seriously. "Well, there was the gallery filled with mirrors when it should have been filled with paintings. And that woman you met at Cary Park who claimed to be Miranda Glass but looked nothing like the Miranda Glass we interviewed. And the way your radio picked up those weird transmissions. He paused. But I figured there had to be logical explanations for all of that. What if the logical explanation is that reality is more flexible than we thought? Then I guess I need to expand my definition of logical, Webb said dryly. But Sarah, are you telling me that all of this, the mirrors, the impossible circumstances, the people who seem to know things they shouldn't know, it was all real? It was all real, and it's being handled by people who understand it better than we do. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. Detective Chen, we do have one more matter to discuss with you. During your crossing, you accessed classified information about interdimensional research protocols. You also demonstrated an unusual aptitude for dimensional navigation. We'd like to offer you a position with our task force. Sarah looked around the room at the mirrors that had started this entire adventure. Each one still showed reflections, but now she knew they were more than just reflections. They were windows into infinite possibilities, infinite versions of herself and everyone she knew. What would the job involve? Investigating dimensional crimes, cases where people abuse crossing technology for illegal purposes, helping people who become lost between realities, serving as a liaison between conventional law enforcement and interdimensional research. Dr. Martinez smiled. It's essentially police work, but with a much broader definition of jurisdiction, Yazius. Sarah thought about the choice she'd made in David's mirror array, to return to her own life, her own reality, her own problems. But she also thought about the people who might need help navigating between realities, who might become lost or confused or taken advantage of by those who would abuse the technology. Would I still work with Detective Webb? If he's interested in joining the task force as well, we'll need conventional law enforcement officers who can adapt to unconventional circumstances. Sarah looked at her partner, who was still trying to process the morning's revelations. Webb? Want to investigate impossible crimes in parallel universes? Do I have a choice? After what I've seen today, regular police work is going to seem pretty boring. Webb grinned, the expression transforming his face from confused to excited. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on you when you start stepping through mirrors. Dr. Martinez made notes on her clipboard. Excellent. You'll both need to undergo orientation training and psychological evaluation before we can clear you for active dimensional duty. But Detective Chen, your actions today in preventing uncontrolled dimensional crossing and ensuring proper regulation of the technology have already demonstrated your qualifications for this work. What about Miranda Glass? The real Miranda Glass from this reality. Ms. Glass has been located and debriefed. She's chosen to work with our Cultural Affairs Division, helping to document the artistic and creative differences between parallel realities. It turns out that interdimensional art curation is going to be a significant field of study. Sarah realized that everyone who had been touched by David's discovery was finding their place in this new reality where dimensional crossing was possible and regulated. It was as if the universe was reorganizing itself around the existence of the technology, creating new roles and new purposes for people whose lives had been changed by contact with parallel worlds. Dr. Martinez, can I ask you something personal? Of course. In your reality, wherever you came from originally, what was your life like before you became involved in interdimensional research? Dr. Martinez's professional demeanor softened slightly. I was a theoretical physicist who spent years writing papers that no one believed, trying to prove theories that mainstream science considered impossible. When dimensional crossing was discovered, I finally found a reality where my work was valued, and my theories were recognized as breakthrough science. So you chose to come to this reality? I chose to help create this reality. That's what dimensional crossing really offers. Not just the ability to find better versions of our lives, but the ability to actively participate in creating better versions of our world. Sarah thought about this as the research team continued their work around them. The mirrors were no longer just portals to alternate realities. They were tools for consciously improving reality, for taking the best elements from multiple worlds and combining them into something better than any individual universe could achieve alone. "When do we start training?" she asked. Chapter 10. New Reflections. 3 months later, Detective Sarah Chen of the Interdimensional Crimes Task Force stood in front of the Meridian Gallery, which had been converted into the Pacific Northwest's first public dimensional crossing facility. The gallery's elegant windows now displayed not artwork, but carefully regulated mirror portals that allowed citizens to explore alternate versions of their lives under professional supervision. "Still weird seeing it like this," Webb said, joining her on the sidewalk outside. He wore the same clothes as always, but now carried equipment designed to detect and track dimensional anomalies. "Remember when this was just a regular art gallery where someone had stolen some paintings?" "Technically, no one had stolen anything," Sarah corrected. David had just moved his artwork to a parallel dimension where it would be safer during the crossing event. "Right, because that's a normal sentence that makes perfect sense now." Sarah grinned. 3 months of working dimensional crimes had given both of them a peculiar perspective on what constituted normal. They'd investigated cases of people using dimensional crossing to commit identity theft by trading places with more successful versions of themselves. They'd helped lost individuals who'd accidentally stepped through mirrors into realities where their families didn't recognize them. They'd even tracked down a criminal who had been using dimensional portals to rob banks in parallel universes where he didn't exist. "Today's case should be relatively straightforward," Sarah said, checking her tablet for the details of their current assignment. "Missing person report. Margaret Sullivan, age 67, disappeared 3 days ago after a supervised crossing session. She was exploring a reality where her husband hadn't died in Vietnam." "Let me guess. She decided to stay there instead of coming back." "That's what we need to find out." Sarah approached the gallery's entrance where a small sign now read, "Meridian Dimensional Services. Explore your possibilities safely." Inside, the space had been transformed into something between a high-tech laboratory and a therapeutic counseling center. The mirrors were still there, but now they were surrounded by monitoring equipment, comfortable seating areas, and consultation rooms where trained counselors helped people prepare for dimensional crossings. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had become the facility's director, met them in the main crossing chamber. "Detectives, thank you for coming. Margaret's case is complicated." "Complicated how?" Sarah asked. She didn't just cross into a reality where her husband survived Vietnam. She crossed into a reality where she never married him at all, where she made completely different life choices. The Margaret who exists in that reality is a successful artist who never had children, never experienced the grief of losing a spouse. Webb frowned. "So there are 2 Margarets in that reality now?" "No, that's just it. When someone crosses into a reality where they made fundamentally different life choices, they don't encounter an alternate version of themselves. They become that alternate version. with all the memories and experiences that version would have had. Sarah felt a chill of understanding, meaning our Margaret Sullivan effectively ceased to exist the moment she crossed over? Technically, yes. The woman who exists in that reality is still Margaret Sullivan, but she's Margaret Sullivan as she would have been if she'd made different choices 70 years ago. She has no memory of the life she left behind in our reality. Then how do we even know she wants to come back? Dr. Martinez led them to a monitoring station where technicians track dimensional crossings in real time. Because she's been trying to. Our sensors show repeated attempts to activate crossing portals in that reality, but they're not working properly. It's as if part of her consciousness remembers this reality and wants to return, but part of her is integrated into the life she's living there. Sarah studied the readouts on the monitoring screens. After 3 months of dimensional crime work, she'd learned to interpret the energy patterns that indicated crossing attempts, displacement events, and dimensional instabilities. "This looks like psychological fragmentation," she said. "She's experiencing memories and desires from both realities simultaneously." Exactly. And if we don't help her resolve this conflict soon, she could suffer complete psychological collapse. Or worse, she could damage the barrier between realities in that sector. Webb was examining a large mirror that showed what appeared to be an artist's studio in another dimension. Is that her? Sarah looked into the mirror and saw an elderly woman with paint-stained hands working at an easel. The woman looked healthy and vibrant, completely absorbed in her work, but there was something in her expression, a confusion or sadness that suggested internal conflict. That's her, Margaret Sullivan, as she would have been if she'd pursued art instead of marriage and motherhood. Dr. Martinez adjusted the mirror's settings, and they could see more of the surrounding space. She's been painting the same subject repeatedly for the past 3 days. The subject was a young soldier in a Vietnam-era military uniform, rendered with the kind of loving detail that suggested deep emotional connection. Around the studio, dozens of similar paintings showed the same face from different angles, different expressions, different contexts. She's painting her husband, Sarah realized, the husband she never married in that reality, but whose memory is bleeding through from our reality. Which means part of her consciousness is still connected to her original life, Webb said. She wants to come back, but she's trapped in a reality where she doesn't consciously remember why. Sarah made a decision. I'm going to cross over and talk to her. Detective, that's not advisable. If you cross into a reality where you made fundamentally different life choices, you could experience the same fragmentation Margaret is suffering from. Not if I cross as myself from this reality, maintaining my original memories and identity. David taught me how to do controlled crossings that preserve consciousness across dimensional barriers. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Detective, that technique is still experimental. We don't have full safety protocols for... Dr. Martinez, a woman is suffering psychological fragmentation that could lead to dimensional instability. Standard procedures aren't going to help her. Sarah approached the mirror, showing Margaret's studio. Webb, monitor my vital signs and dimensional signature. If anything goes wrong, pull me back immediately. Sarah, I really don't like... I know, but we can't help her from this side of the mirror. Sarah placed her hands on the mirror's surface and focused her consciousness the way David had taught her, maintaining her identity, her memories, her connection to her original reality, while allowing her physical form to cross into the parallel world. The transition was disorienting but brief, and she found herself standing in Margaret's studio while still retaining full awareness of her life as an interdimensional crimes detective. "Mrs. Sullivan?" The elderly woman turned from her easel, and Sarah saw immediately that Dr. Martinez had been right. Margaret's eyes held the kind of confusion that came from experiencing conflicting realities. "Do I know you?" Margaret asked, but her tone suggested she thought she should know Sarah. "I'm Detective Chen. I'm here because you've been trying to get back to your original reality, the one where you married James and lived a different life." Margaret's paintbrush fell from her hand. "James? Yes, I dream about him every night. But that's impossible, because I never married anyone named James. I've been an artist my entire life. I never had children. She trailed off, staring at the paintings of the soldier surrounding them. "But I keep painting his face. Why do I keep painting his face if I never met him?" "Because you did meet him in another reality. You married him. You had children with him. You lived 40 years together before he died. Those memories are real, Mrs. Sullivan, but they're memories from a parallel version of your life." Margaret sat down heavily in a paint-stained chair. "You're saying I'm living in the wrong reality?" "I'm saying you're living in a reality that conflicts with your most important memories and relationships. Your consciousness is trying to exist in two different life stories simultaneously, and that's causing the confusion and psychological distress you've been experiencing. Can you take me back to the reality where James and I were married?" Sarah thought about the choice Margaret would be making, leaving behind a lifetime of artistic achievement and independent success to return to a reality of different satisfactions, different losses. "I can take you back, but you need to understand what you be returning to. In that reality, James is dead. You're a widow living alone, struggling with grief and loneliness. The life you've built here as an artist, all of that would be gone." Margaret looked around her studio at the paintings, sculptures, and creative works that represented decades of artistic development. Then she looked back at the repeated portraits of James. "Detective, can I ask you something? In your experience with these parallel realities, do people usually choose the life that made them happier, or the life that made them who they really are?" The question struck Sarah as profoundly important. "What do you think the difference is?" "I've been happier in this reality. I've had a successful career. I've created things that will outlast me. I've lived independently and freely. But—" Margaret touched one of the portraits. "But I've never loved anyone the way I loved James. And I've never experienced the kind of deep connection that comes from building a life with another person, even if that life includes loss and grief. So which life feels more authentic to you?" Margaret was quiet for a long time, studying the paintings around her. When she looked up, her expression had cleared, as if the internal conflict had finally resolved itself. "The life with James feels more like who I really am, even though this life might objectively be better. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Sarah said. "Are you ready to go back?" Margaret nodded, then paused. "Will I remember this reality? The art, the independence, the different path I took?" "You'll remember it the way you remember a very vivid dream. The memories will fade over time, but they'll leave you with a deeper appreciation for the choices you made in your original reality." As Sarah helped Margaret cross back through the dimensional mirror, she reflected on the cases she'd worked over the past 3 months. Almost everyone who explored parallel versions of their lives eventually chose to return to their original realities, even when the alternatives seemed objectively better. It suggested something profound about human nature, that authenticity and genuine connection mattered more than simple happiness or success. Webb was waiting for them when they emerged from the mirror, relief evident on his face. "Everything go okay?" "Better than okay," Sarah said. "Mrs. Sullivan, how are you feeling?" Margaret looked around the facility with clear eyes and a peaceful expression. "Like I'm exactly where I belong," she said. "Even with all the grief and loss, this feels like my real life." As they watched Margaret reunite with her family members who had been waiting anxiously for her return, Dr. Martinez approached Sarah. "Detective, that was excellent work. Textbook consciousness preservation during complex dimensional crossing. Have you considered teaching our advanced crossing techniques seminar?" Sarah thought about the offer while watching Margaret embrace her daughter, a daughter who didn't exist in the reality where Margaret had been an artist. "Maybe someday. But right now, I think I prefer investigating these cases to teaching about them." "Any particular reason?" Sarah looked around the facility at the mirrors showing glimpses of infinite possibilities, infinite versions of every life, every choice, every path that could be taken. Because every case teaches me something new about what it means to be authentically yourself, even when you could be anyone else. As they left the facility, Webb glanced back at the mirrors one more time. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Have you ever been tempted to cross over, to explore what your life might have been like if you'd made different choices?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. In her 3 months of dimensional crime work, she'd had countless opportunities to glimpse alternate versions of her existence, realities where she'd married differently, chosen different careers, lived in different cities, made different decisions about family and relationships. "I've been tempted," she admitted, "but every case I work reinforces the same lesson. The life you've actually lived, with all its mistakes and missed opportunities, is still your life. Trading it for a theoretically better alternative means giving up everything that made you who you are. Even the painful parts? Especially the painful parts. They're what teach us compassion, resilience, and appreciation for the good things when they come along." Webb nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying all those parallel realities where we made better choices are just illusions of perfectibility?" "I'm saying they're real alternatives, but they come with their own problems and limitations that we can't see from this side of the mirror. The grass is always greener in another dimension, but it still needs to be mowed." As they walked back to their patrol car, Sarah caught a reflection of herself in a storefront window. For just a moment, she saw not just her current self, but glimpses of all the other Sarah Chens she could have been. The federal agent, the scientist, the artist, the wife and mother. They were all real, all valid, all possible. But the Sarah Chen walking down a Seattle street with her partner after successfully helping someone find their way home, that was the one she chose to be. Epilogue. The gallery opening. 1 year after David Kemp's breakthrough discovery, the Meridian Gallery held its grand reopening as the world's first museum of parallel lives. The exhibition, Reflections of Possibility, featured not just David's original mirror installations, but contributions from artists, scientists, and ordinary people who had explored alternate versions of their existence. Detective Sarah Chen of the Interdimensional Crimes Task Force stood in the museum's main hall, watching visitors interact with carefully regulated mirror portals that offered glimpses into parallel realities. Children pressed their faces against mirrors that showed them as adults in different careers. Elderly couples held hands while looking into reflections that showed them in realities where they'd met earlier, or later, or under different circumstances. Hard to believe it's only been a year, Webb said, joining her near David's original mirror array, which now served as the centerpiece of the museum's permanent collection. Seems like a lifetime, Sarah agreed, or several lifetimes, depending on how you count. David Kemp approached them, looking healthier and more at peace than when Sarah had first encountered him in his warehouse laboratory. As the museum's chief curator and the world's foremost expert on interdimensional art, he had found a role that allowed him to share his discoveries while ensuring they were used responsibly. "Detectives, thank you for coming to the opening," he said. "I wanted to show you something special." He led them to a new installation near the back of the museum, a single, unassuming mirror with a small placard that read, "The Mirror of True Reflection." "What's special about this one?" Sarah asked. "It only shows you exactly as you are, in this reality, at this moment," David explained. "No alternate versions, no parallel possibilities, no glimpses of what might have been. Just you." Sarah looked into the mirror and saw herself, tired from a long day of work, wearing clothes that were practical rather than fashionable, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of confidence that came from a year of solving impossible cases. She looked exactly like what she was, a detective who had found her calling in work that mattered. "That's it?" Webb asked, looking at his own reflection. "No magic, no parallel dimensions?" "Sometimes," David said quietly, "the most radical thing you can do is accept yourself exactly as you are, without comparison to who you might have been or could become in other realities. This mirror reminds visitors that their current life, whatever its limitations, is real, present, and valuable." As they watched, other visitors discovered the mirror of true reflection. Some spent only a few seconds looking at themselves before moving on to more exotic displays. Others stood for long minutes, studying their reflections with expressions of recognition, acceptance, or quiet satisfaction. "It's beautiful," said a familiar voice behind them. Sarah turned to see Miranda Glass, the original Miranda Glass from their reality, approaching with a small group of visitors she was guiding through the museum. As the institution's director of public relations, Miranda had found her calling in helping people understand the philosophical and ethical implications of interdimensional access. "Miranda, how have the visitor responses been?" Sarah asked. "Fascinating. We've had over 10,000 people use the crossing facilities in the past 6 months. And do you know what percentage chose to permanently relocate to parallel realities?" "I'm afraid to guess." "Less than 3%. Most people, when given the opportunity to actually experience alternate versions of their lives, discover that their original reality, problems and all, feels like home." Webb laughed. "So all this advanced interdimensional technology basically confirms what philosophers have been saying for centuries. Happiness comes from accepting your circumstances rather than trying to change them." "Not exactly," David said. "It's more that having the option to change your circumstances makes it easier to appreciate them. When people know they could explore different versions of their lives, they stop spending so much time wondering, what if, and start focusing on making their actual lives meaningful." Sarah thought about this as they walked through the museum, passing mirrors that showed glimpses of infinite possibilities. The paradox was beautiful in its simplicity. The more access people had to alternate realities, the more they valued their original reality. "Sarah," Miranda said as they approached the museum's exit, "I have something for you." She handed Sarah a small wrapped package. Inside was a compact mirror, similar to the one the alternate reality Miranda had given her a year ago, but simpler, more elegant. "What's this for?" "It's a reminder," Miranda said, "not of the realities you could access, but of the reality you chose. Every time you look into it, you'll see someone who faced infinite possibilities and decided that her own life, her own choices, her own mistakes and achievements were worth keeping." Sarah looked into the mirror and saw herself. Detective Sarah Chen, interdimensional crimes investigator, a woman who had solved the most impossible case of her career by learning that some things were too important to change, even when change was possible. "Thank you," she said. As she and Webb left the museum and walked out into the Seattle evening, Sarah reflected on the year that had passed since their investigation began. The city around them looked the same as always, but she knew it was fundamentally different, a place where the boundaries between possible and actual had become permeable, where people could explore infinite versions of their lives while still choosing to live the one they'd been given. "Sarah," Webb said as they reached their car, "do you ever regret not taking the federal job? Or staying in this reality instead of crossing over to one where your career went differently?" Sarah considered the question while looking at her reflection in the car's window. In its surface, she could see not just herself, but hints of all the other Sarah Chens she had encountered over the past year: the federal agent, the scientist, the alternate reality versions who had made different choices and lived different lives. "No," she said finally, "this is exactly where I belong." As they drove through the city where anything was possible, but most people chose to remain exactly where they were, Sarah Chen smiled at the profound ordinariness of it all. In a world where mirrors could show you infinite alternatives to your life, the most radical choice was still the simplest one: to be authentically, completely yourself. The case of the missing artwork at the Meridian Gallery had been solved long ago. The real mystery, how to live a meaningful life in a universe of infinite possibilities, was one that Sarah Chen would spend the rest of her career investigating, one reflection at a time.